This week, it's been over a week since the US elections, and arguably a lot has changed. By any reasonable indication, Joe Biden is the next president of the United States, but the situation with Congress is not so clear, and control of the Senate is actually a pretty Jewy affair. That story, along with a look at some other Jewish election news, coming up. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So let's just start off with an overview of the federal results of the election as of this podcast going up for President, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And to say it again, Joe Biden won the election. According to the New York Times, he has 279 of the 270 electoral votes needed to win, while the Associated Press, which called Arizona for Biden, has him with 290 electoral votes. Georgia and North Carolina still haven't been called for Biden or Trump, and some news and polling organizations consider Arizona to also not have a result yet. When it comes to the House of Representatives, Democrats kept their majority but lost 6 seats to Republicans, and 15 seats still haven't been called. In the Senate, this is where things are extra spicy. Okay, that's a terrible way to put it, but we're just going to move on. The Senate is the big player, that's what I meant. Controlled by Republicans since 2014, it's still not clear who will end up on top this time. Projections from before the election were very optimistic that Democrats would gain control of the Senate, but there just wasn't the kind of sweep that some people expected. Republicans lost just 1 seat, although potentially only one so far. Right now, Republicans have 50 seats, Democrats have 46, and there are 2 independent senators who tend to vote with the Democrats. So you can consider the Democrats at 48 seats. Remember, this is in the 100-seat Senate, so if the Republicans gain just 1 more seat, they'll keep control of the place. The best chance for Democrats to avoid that is to land the last 2 seats, which would create a perfect 50-50 tie and bring in Democratic Kamala Harris, the soon-to-be vice president, as the deciding tie-breaking vote, which is the constitutional power of the vice president. So it would sort of be a Democrat-controlled Senate that way. Now here's where we start to really bring the Jews in. Both of the Senate seats that are open are from Georgia, and this isn't a matter of still waiting for the votes to be counted from Election Day. What happened here is that in Georgia, candidates have to win a majority of votes to win an election. And for both Senate races, no candidate got over 50% of the vote. So now runoff elections are being held on January 5th for the seats. And one of the seats has a Jewish Democrat, Jon Ossoff, running for it against a Republican incumbent. So, kind of cool, Jews everywhere, yay. But we also have to be honest with ourselves that could make for a situation with an extra amount of anti-Semitism playing out. And by could, I mean probably will. Ossoff's opponent, David Perdue, was already caught this summer advertising against Ossoff using a photo that had been photoshopped to make Ossoff's nose look bigger. So Jew plus big nose, maybe not the best way to go after your opponent. Perdue's campaign pulled that ad and said that the Photoshop had been accidental, which, let's just hope that in a highly contentious runoff election, during a highly contentious election cycle, during a very chaotic time, that's the extent of the anti-Semitism that shows up here. On the plus side, a lot of Jews are actually pretty happy with the way Ossoff looks already, with a handful of articles in the Jewish press all about how hot the 33-year-old politician is. So I guess eat your hearts out, anti-Semites, because we like our big noses. But the Jewish political fun, if you can call it that, in Georgia, does not stop there. The Democratic candidate for the other Georgia Senate seat, Reverend Raphael Warnock, who, side note, serves at the same church Martin Luther King Jr. did, is being attacked for, of all things, Israel. The whole shtick here is that Warnock has been very critical of Israel in some of his sermons, like in this excerpt from a sermon in 2018 that criticized the move of the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is Israel's capital. He referenced the Palestinian protests against the move, most notably on the border with Gaza, saying, quote, we saw the government of Israel shoot down unarmed Palestinian sisters and brothers like birds of prey. And I don't care who does it, it is wrong. It is wrong to shoot down God's children like they don't matter at all, and it's no more anti-Semitic for me to say that than it is anti-white for me to say that Black lives matter, Palestinian lives matter." End quote. On a side note, and to give a little more context here, describing any event in the Middle East is a headache to nail down with the right description depending on who you ask. What some called unarmed protests, many in Israel saw as riots and violent demonstrations, with Molotov cocktails being thrown at the Gaza border at Israeli soldiers, and explosive kites and balloons being sent from Gaza to burn acres of Israeli farmland. Now, that's not to justify the Israeli response, which is a discussion for another podcast. I will just tell you that on the same day the U.S. Embassy to Israel officially opened in Jerusalem, there were reportedly 58 Palestinians killed, of which some are reportedly members of the terrorist group Hamas in Gaza, and thousands were wounded by Israeli soldiers in what Israeli officials described as border defense. If you want to read more, there's a Times of Israel story that covers this pretty well in the podcast notes, so check that out. Back to Warnock. Clearly, saying that Israel shot down Palestinians, quote, like birds of prey, is inexcusable to right-wing Jews, and at best uncomfortable for many liberal Jews, and for many evangelical Christians who are perhaps the more important voting bloc to focus on here. That language is also inexcusable. Warnock also, after a trip to Israel and the Palestinian territories as part of a cohort of Black Christian leaders from the United States and South Africa, signed on to a joint letter that said stuff like this, quote, "We saw the patterns that seem to have been borrowed and perfected from other previous oppressive regimes. The ever-present physical walls that wall in Palestinians in a political wall reminiscent of the Berlin Wall. Roads built through occupied Palestinian villages on which Palestinians are not permitted to drive, and homes and families divided by walls and barriers. The heavy militarization of the West Bank, reminiscent of the military occupation of Namibia by apartheid South Africa." End quote. So, again, not glowing language for Israeli control of the West Bank. And this is language that could turn into a serious issue for some voters, but how many voters will be a good question. But Warnock's election efforts are likely going to be pretty tied to the Israel narrative either way over the next 2 months. And to be honest, that really is just my assessment, so pound of salt, but given how Israel is almost constantly used in the political game across the country, I would really be surprised if this doesn't become a defining feature of this runoff election. I also want to say, because somebody should just say it, I do doubt that during a pandemic that has created an economic emergency and exacerbated other issues and inequalities in this country, that Israel will be the main priority for Georgia voters. So this may end up being just as frustrating as it is interesting to watch the runoff election play out. I should also note, and it would be wrong of me to leave this info out, that Warnock sent a letter to J Insider, which first reported on a lot of this stuff, to outline his position on Israel. A link to his letter is in the podcast notes if you want to read it, but a lot of it is pretty standard pro-Israel stuff, actually. Warnock says he wants a two-state solution, will work to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. He says that Israel is in no way an apartheid state, doesn't want to condition aid to Israel, does want to keep giving military aid to Israel, and opposes the boycott, divestment, and sanctions or BDS movement against Israel, and even called it anti-Semitic. In the bigger picture, both Warnock and Ossoff are very competitive in the Georgia Senate races, but the odds may be against them and thus against any kind of Democratic control of the Senate. According to 538, a news site that does in-depth political data analysis, Georgia runoff elections tend to favor Republicans. Then again, the rules may be thrown out of the window right now because President-elect Biden seems to be the first Democrat to win Georgia in a presidential election since Bill Clinton in 1992. And I say seems because Georgia recently announced that they're doing by hand a total recount of the presidential election. But anyway, who knows what we'll see in January when the runoff elections happen. But I'm sure it'll come up again on this podcast in the meantime, seeing as how involved Jews and Jewish narratives are here. In some other Jewish election tidbits, now that Kamala Harris is the vice president-elect, which Let's just take a moment and appreciate that she's the first Black, South Asian, and female vice president in American history. Pretty awesome. But now, there's not only the first second gentleman ever, but the first Jewish second gentleman ever, which is Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff. So, also cool. And it's also notable, given the complicated relationship American Jewish institutions have with this, that Harris and Emhoff are in an interfaith marriage. And a couple of commentators across the Jewish Twitter and blogosphere have already said this, but it's worth saying again and again. Kind of makes you wonder how many Jews will be proud of this kind of Jewish representation, but still mistreat or feel queasy about interfaith marriage and relationships. Food for thought. And in ultra recent news, Joe Biden has reportedly picked Ron Klain, a Jewish guy, to be his chief of staff. So as usual, the Jews are not just tired, but also everywhere. Make of that what you will. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.